Hello everybody, Mr. Science Guy here, and today we're going to look at how to design and plan an experiment that you can use in your science fair project. By now, you should have identified a science fair style question that you want to investigate, and you should have researched that by using the internet and other sources, compiling your findings in a first draft of a report. If you aren't sure how to do these things, if you haven't done these steps yet and you need a little bit of a guide, you can check out my YouTube channel, which is simply named Kite and Burger. And underneath, you'll see in the description, I will provide links to these previous videos, which you can see titled here. The first step to designing an experiment is stating your hypothesis. For this particular example, I'm going to be investigating the question, can the food we eat affect our heart rate? Your hypothesis ideally should be in if-then format. It should make it clear what's being tested, which is your independent variable, and it should make it clear what you expect the result to be for each group. We call that the dependent variable. So a bad example of a hypothesis or an incomplete hypothesis would be people who eat healthier have a lower heart rate. On the other hand, a good example of a hypothesis in if-then format, this is a fully developed hypothesis. If people eat healthier foods, low in saturated fat, sodium, and cholesterol for 3 weeks, then they will experience a lower resting heart rate and lower blood pressure than people who eat foods high in those same factors. So as you can see, a very well-developed hypothesis includes some features like if-then format. It makes it clear what's being tested, the independent variable, and then it also makes it clear what you expect the result to be. So once you've identified your hypothesis, you can then break that hypothesis down into the independent and dependent variables, the IV and DV. So here again is our well-developed hypothesis. If people eat healthier foods, low in saturated fat, sodium, and cholesterol for 3 weeks, then they will experience a lower resting heart rate and lower blood pressure than people who eat foods high in those same factors. In pink, you'll see our independent variable. In pink, you'll see our independent variable, which is diet. The independent variable is what you as the experimenter change, and it is the only factor that you as the experimenter should change. The independent variable is independent of the dependent variable. In other words, a change in the independent variable doesn't need to occur because something else changed in the experiment. It's something you're changing as the experimenter. In green, and underlined in green, you can see the dependent variable, which is our resting heart rate and blood pressure. The dependent variable is what you as the experimenter will measure as a result, and it is dependent on the IV, meaning that a change in the independent variable could or might result in a change in the dependent variable, which is why the dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. After you've identified your independent and dependent variables, the next step would be identifying your controlled variables. Now, controlled variables are any variables that must remain constant. This allows you to be sure that nothing interferes with your results in determining the impact of the IV on the DV. And I'm going to take a moment now to let people think of a few variables that must remain constant in order to measure the effect of diet on heart rate and blood pressure. So, hint. If you are thinking at home, think of things besides diet that might affect heart rate and blood pressure. These would be some of your controlled variables. Give you a second here to pause. And if you're coming back now, you can take a look at some of the factors that affect heart rate besides diet that you would need to want to consider before carrying out an experiment like this. Of course, the age of your human subjects certainly could affect their resting heart rate and their blood pressure. The health of their heart and the health of their general body health could affect them and their heart rate and their blood pressure. You want to make sure that each group receives the same experimental diet. You want to make sure that the number of subjects in each group is the same, the exercise habits of each subject is the same, and the lifestyle of each subject is the same. Of course, there are more factors that could be considered. Besides age, there's gender, there's race, there's any number of things. When it comes to human experimentation, the number of variables are as variable as humans are. And in order to ensure consistency in results, sometimes you want to embrace those differences, and other times you want to isolate the variables that you're testing and make sure that you are using a uniform test group. Something to consider. Once you've identified your independent variable, your dependent variable, your controlled variables, it's now time to start identifying your groups, your experimental groups, which will be exposed to the changes in the independent variable, the treatments, which is essentially how you're going to change the independent variable for each group, and then the control group, which will, basically let you understand if your results actually have any significance. So the experimental groups, in this case, we're going to go with 2 groups, 10 adults, 5 men and 5 women in each group. We're going to have them aged between 30 and 40 with similar medical history. The treatments we're going to apply to each group, one group of 10 is going to receive 3 weeks of a nutritionally balanced diet, while the other group receives 3 weeks of a modified diet containing the same meals, but with a higher amount of saturated fat, sodium, and cholesterol. This ensures that they're receiving the same meals, but they have a higher concentration, a higher amount of those risk factors, saturated fat, sodium, and cholesterol. Then we're looking at our control group. This is one group of 10 adults, 5 men and 5 women, aged between 30 and 40 with similar medical histories. And they're not going to modify their diet at all for 3 weeks. They're going to continue to eat what they usually eat and keep that all the same. Step 5, once you've identified your groups, now you've got to identify what you're going to test, when you're going to test, and how often you're going to measure it, and how you're going to measure it. The subject's resting heart rates and blood pressure in this case, we're going to go with diastolic and systolic pressure. It's going to be measured 3 times before the start of the experiment to get baseline data. The subject's resting heart rates and blood pressure will be measured every day, 3 times a day at 8 a.m., 12 p.m., and 4 p.m. The values will be averaged for each day, plotted on a line graph, and compared to previous and subsequent days. Subjects' resting heart rates will be measured by taking their pulse for 15 seconds and then multiplying that number by 4 to get their beats per minute. And the subject's diastolic and systolic blood pressure will be measured using a sphygmomanometer or blood pressure meter. So what this step allows you to do is lay out exactly how you're going to test, what you're going to test, and when you're going to test it. So it's important to do this because otherwise you end up having a very long, convoluted explanation in your procedure, which should be very succinct and clear. So once you have all this information together, you can put it together in a step-by-step procedure. So step 1, once you know how you're going to be doing the measurements, once you know how to get that baseline data, you can just say, step 1, get baseline resting heart rate, BPM, and diastolic and systolic blood pressure data for each subject. Step 2, 10 subjects will eat a healthy diet. Now, clearly we didn't decide what a healthy diet was, but this is something that you would find through your research. All we said that it is a diet that is low in saturated fat, sodium, and cholesterol. 10 subjects will eat an unhealthy diet. Again, that is determined through the research that I did to be a diet high in saturated fat, cholesterol, and sodium. And 10 subjects will not change their current diet. All subjects will continue this diet for 3 weeks and keep a journal of all the food they eat. The journal is to help keep track of what they've consumed to see if there's any variation, see if they strayed from the experiment. And then subjects are otherwise not going to change their daily routines. This helps us to allow for a more natural assessment of the impact of diet. Granted, we have to account for every subject having different lifestyles, and a big part of that will be choosing subjects that live a similar lifestyle. Step 3, we're going to measure each subject's resting heart rate and blood pressure 3 times a day at 8 a.m., 12 p.m., and 4 p.m. to record the data, and then we're going to compare the change between each group's data. So, granted, I could have just put together this 4-step procedure without the previous steps, but bear in mind that without having done steps 1 through 5 before putting together this 4-step procedure, I would not have been able to thoroughly explain how the testing would be done. I would not have been able to fully explain what we would be testing and what would be changed. So, granted, this is still not as specific as it could be. There's certainly some information that could be added. So I'll give you some time to think about that as well. Consider that, every time you put together a procedure, you want to be as clear as possible. If you are setting up the experiment as I have with these 6 steps so that you have your procedure put together, by the time you put your procedure together, you should know all of this background information. So If you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out on the Google Classroom or leave them in the comments below. Thank you again so much for listening. This has been a lesson on how to design an experiment with Mr. Kai.